Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone. We appreciate you joining us for today's Progress Semaphore webinar. This is part two of our series on getting business buy-in. We're pleased to continue the conversation with a deeper focus on aligning product initiatives with stakeholder priorities and demonstrating tangible business value. We are honored to be joined today by Ahren Lehnert, Principal Taxonomist at Nike. Before we begin, a quick note. As we move through today's webinar, please feel free to submit your questions at any time using the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll reserve time at the end of the session to address as many as possible. Allow me to introduce today's speakers. My name is Hinal Patel, and I serve as a product marketing specialist here at Progress. I am joined by my colleague, Gerard Rebalsky, senior sales manager who brings extensive experience helping organizations communicate the strategic value of semantic technologies. And of course, we're especially pleased to welcome Ahren Lehnert, principal taxonomist at Nike, who will be offering a valuable industry perspective on how to engage stakeholders and secure buy-in for enterprise taxonomy efforts. As we begin, I'd like to share a thought-provoking quote from George Bernard Shaw. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that has taken place. This quote sets the tone for today's discussion. Often the challenge is not whether we are communicating, but whether our message is being received in a meaningful, actionable way. And our goal is to explore on how we can better bridge that gap, particularly when discussing complex or unfamiliar technologies. Before we dive in today's discussion, let's briefly revisit some key takeaways from part one of our webinar series. First, align with business priorities. Anchor your product investments to strategic objectives such as growth, efficiency, risk mitigation, or customer experience. Second, speak the stakeholders' language. Tailor your messaging to reflect what matters most to each stakeholder group. Third, quantify value. Use concrete data to translate features into measurable business impact. Fourth, leverage real-world examples. Customer stories enhance relatability and lend credibility. Last, be proactive. Anticipate concerns and prepare a compelling case that highlights both tangible and intangible benefits. These principles will continue to guide our conversation today. If you're unable to attend the first session, we encourage you to review the available resources. You can watch the full webinar securing stakeholder buy-in and how to show the business value of product investments to gain practical frameworks for stakeholder engagement. Additionally, our blog post, Getting Business Buy-in, Keys to Success in 2025, provides valuable guidance on building persuasive business cases across stakeholder groups. With that, let's begin our discussion. I'll now turn it over to Gerard and Ahren to get us started.
Thank you very much, Anel, for the introduction. Ahren, good to see you again. Thanks for joining. I think this is really important. As we alluded to the previous session, it's nice to hear it from somebody that's not in the trenches, so to speak, but that has some experience from my days at Gartner, where I spent a lot of time helping customers sell the value and help them communicate, typically from the IT side, but over to other business units like marketing and other areas of the business as well to prove value in the technologies or people or processes that they were trying to adopt. So, getting somebody, that's in that battle, so to speak, every day. I kind of wanted to start the questions off with, what's the biggest challenge you faced at Nike with getting, or anywhere in your past, where you've had, a difficulty getting the business side to buy in to a technology that you were looking to adopt?
Yeah, so first off, thanks for having me here. Really happy to be here. I'd say there's common themes. I think that cultures can change between different organizations, but the problems tend to remain the same. And one of the things that I've experienced often is that the business side of the house doesn't necessarily understand the purpose or intent of the technology. And that can be especially true in sort of niche spaces or areas like taxonomy and ontology management. There can be a sort of a lack of clarity about what this software is intended to address. And again, this kind of depends on who's driving the purchase here, but that can be very common. And another fact that I've seen quite often is potential overlap with other existing systems that aren't necessarily intended to address what you're trying to solve with a new technology, where you get the why are we looking at this when we have this, right? And maybe there's a misalignment or a misunderstanding there between what the technologies do. I think another factor is the what's in it for me factor. When there's technology or process changes, right? Um, I think that some business users become married, if you will, to a software technology. And sometimes it can even be to the point where they're the expert in it. And if you come along and say, well, we're going to change the technology, you're taking inadvertently something away from them. And they may feel uncomfortable with that, right? I know how to use this system. I'm really good at it and I'm perceived as an expert. And now you want to give me something else. And I'm not necessarily happy about that. Um, and finally, this is my sort of last big category of things that I see as a problem for business buy-in. It can just be budget and resourcing. Like it's just practical, right? That we want to do this thing, but we work for an organization that maybe we don't have a budget. This can be true of governmental or nonprofit organizations. We want to do this thing that you say you can do. We want to do it as well as some big company, but we don't have any budget. What can you do for us? And that can be a problem too. Of well, what are your real options there? What can you do?
Yeah, those are all, you actually bring up great points. And I think, in the first session, we touch on a lot of these and sort of how to overcome it. But I think it's also important to stress the fact that there's nobody's batting 1,000, in these cases across the board. But what you at least want to do is make sure that your message was clear. And that if, an opportunity such as, hey, budget cuts this year, economy's not good, we're pulling back, that you can revisit it the following year.
Yeah.
But that, that message that you were sending did resonate, at least on a level outside of, we just don't have the money, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, what do you feel are the most important elements to include in a business case for adopting a new technology?
I think there really needs to be absolute clarity and transparency around the problem that technology is seeking to address. What is the problem statement? What is the use case? And if you've already gotten to this point, why the selected option is the best one. And you might be in a different place in your journey. You may be saying, we need technology. We have no idea who the vendors are. We're just starting the journey and we're going to have a bake off, right? We're going to look at all the vendors. Or maybe you've gotten to the point where you've already selected something, but you have to be very clear about what the problem is. And communicating that to any of the stakeholders, especially if it's coming from the technology side to the business side, or it could be business to business. Maybe one part of the business has recognized a need and they're trying to convince other parts of the business that this is something that should be invested in. So understanding and being very clear about that messaging is critical, so they understand what it's for and what the intent is. I think also making the business case should include some expectations around pricing and build versus buy costs. So in tech savvy organizations, right, you may think that it's a no-brainer. Oh, we're just going to go out and we're going to buy this, and then we'll talk about licensing costs. We'll do this thing, and then somebody comes along and says, well, why don't we build our own, right? And often those conversations can be challenging because maybe there's not, especially in niche software, again, like taxonomy and ontology software. Oh, we'll just build one. Do you know how long some of these tools have been on the market and how many years and perhaps millions of dollars have been invested? And so it can be, you may have the kind of capacity in your org to build something like that, but chances are you're going to spend a lot of time and money to get something that's maybe not quite as good. So you have to set those expectations and set the scope for understanding whether trying to nip that conversation in the bud and say, either we are totally on a build path or we are totally on a buy path, and let's not muddy the waters with additional conversations that sort of distract us from what we're trying to do.
It's a great point you bring up, the build versus buy, because especially nowadays we're seeing a lot of companies move in that direction of just build, right? And with a platform like Semaphore, we've lost a lot of deals because of that. It's also our biggest win back a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road when they realize, even at some of the major technology organizations that are out there, not to be named, where they go, wow, classification's really hard to do. We didn't realize that, right? So it's interesting, that we come up against that so often. But, how are you, do you have any examples or stories you can tell about how you've overcome that?
Yeah, that is very interesting. I'm actually a little surprised that you've come up against that so much. In my
Mhm.
experience, I've come up against it, but not terribly frequently. And usually it just came down to being very transparent about the thing that you have, the product that you're selling. And again, we're talking about taxonomy ontology software, and I myself work for a vendor, so I know what that's about, and trying to convince people that the complexity and the time and the money and the resources that were involved in developing this tool. And again, you can go out on the market and literally see the difference between a brand new tool that is slowly building new functionality and a tool that's been on the market for 10, 15, 20 years. There's a huge difference typically in the types of functionality available. And to understand that nuance, that you're not just building a tree viewer, you're building something with a lot of complexity and understanding the database, really just being very transparent about the potential complexity and the number of hours and resources that were put into building a tool can be fairly convincing to say, that we've been doing this for a while
Yeah,
and it's not that easy.
it's certainly not. And, just a note to the audience, there's the obvious, things. First time I heard that where somebody was like, we're just going to build it ourselves was about 5 years ago with a very large social media company. They eventually came back to us. It was about 3 years later. Um, uh, However, at the time, I think we were so surprised, we kind of just didn't know what to do, right, and how to respond to that. But with the obvious, there's your Gartners with their Magic Quadrants. Infotech is another resource that has very detailed customer-based reviews, right, of across 3 dozen different capabilities as well. So there's information and resources out there, but the best thing you can do is have a base of customers that you can reach out to when you're trying to procure. Is ask the vendor, can you put us in touch with multiple customers that have tried to do this as well and what they came against? And sometimes those stories help
That's a great
get you
method
over that
to
hurdle.
get their story on how challenging it may have been for them. That's a very, very good way to go about it.
Yeah, as a vendor, I'm very aware that it's hard to trust, that we're just telling you the truth. We at Progress here, we do really like to tell you the truth, especially with Semaphore. But it's really just if you can get a referral customer to speak on your behalf, that goes a long way. Speaking of sort of getting other people on board, stakeholder buy-in. Do you see like value in getting a business stakeholder involved early, or uh, you know, at Gartner we used to call this person like the music man, somebody that or musical person, right? Somebody that can speak both tech, understand, what was being articulated from a technical perspective, and then translate that uh, into the business language. Have you, sort of exercised any of that? Do you have any
Yeah.
business partners that you've sort of built relationships with that, and how do you approach that?
Yeah, I think it's essential. So if the need or the recognition that a software needs to come from the technology side, then you have to involve the business partners from the beginning. And I've seen both sides. I have been an employee of a company where something was just rolled out. We didn't know it was coming. We didn't know what we were supposed to do with it. And it's just now here's the system you're going to be using. And I found that very surprising to just like we're going live with this thing. We didn't ask you whether you wanted it. We didn't ask you whether you needed it,
Mm.
but here it is, and here's what you're using, and we've shut everything else down. There's no quicker way to get your business stakeholders angry than to do that. That's a terrible way to do things. And often the need for a technology can arise from the business side where they see gaps in functionality in the tools they're using, or that there's just no tool at all, right? They just don't have it. And so they will be the ones driving it. But it should not be a handover to technology. Say, oh, we need this, and they either go off and try to build it, which we've determined is probably not the best way to do things, or they go out and buy it for you on your behalf and leave you out of the equation. As a business, I think it's not the best way to do it. I think involve them from the beginning in everything. In the choosing of the vendor, if you haven't selected one, they need to, because I'm sure you've been in bake-offs between different vendors, and sometimes it comes down to, yeah, we like this one. This one solves the job better, but we like the UI on this one better, so we're going to pick it,
Yeah, that's a
right? And
big
you
one.
think, well, maybe that's not the most logical reason, but it's a reason and it's valid, and you have to involve the business and let them make those decisions, right? So involving them from the beginning so they feel invested in the purchase or the build or whatever it is, and that it meets their specifications and their requirements from the beginning, you're going to get a lot less resistance in using that tool if they feel like they had a hand in choosing it, right? If they
Yeah.
were involved with it, then they feel like there's more of a personal investment, and so they're probably going to adopt that tool a lot more quickly than just springing it on them or launching something without their buy-in.
It's funny you brought up, I think you just said, we like the way the UI looks. And I remember it was about 10 to 15 years ago, I had an end user uh, that told us they selected a vendor based off of the color scheme that was closely matched to theirs. So, you know, uh, not the decision criteria I would use, but, you know, business makes decisions however they see fit. But
Right.
sort of, leading into that, one of my other really strong suggestions is, what's the business leadership saying on earnings calls, on interviews, what's posted on the website, and how can you articulate or draw that line from what you're trying to do to what leadership is saying the company is trying to do? Do you practice that at all? Do you find that effective or?
100%, 100%. And something that I think is important is to understand the maturity of your organization for that technology. So just being broad about technology, not specifically about taxonomy and ontology, but you've probably seen this or heard about this happening where somebody says, "Ooh, generative AI, fantastic," and they go out and they buy something and they roll it out really quickly, and then they have to reverse course because they didn't do any planning or process planning before, and you had to back up on it. Um, that's not great, and your organization would then not be mature or ready necessarily prepped for that. So conducting a maturity assessment to understand your process landscape and your technology landscape to see if you're ready for that technology to come on board can be a, really useful to understand that just because you have a strategy up at the top levels, are you ready to draw a line to that strategy? I think that's really important because if the company sets objectives and you're raring to go and you want to meet those objectives and you want to engage in the strategy, but you are not in a mature enough place as a culture and processes and technology to meet that, then you're going to have a real misalignment where you're trying to get technology to meet those objectives and you have to roll back on them because you haven't implemented them correctly or people don't know what they're for or they don't know the use case. So, but yeah, I definitely agree with you that if you can align with the strategy, I mean, in all the work that I do, I try to talk about, when we do fiscal year planning, what are we going to do this quarter? What are we going to do the next fiscal year? We always try and draw a line to that next highest objective or KPI, hopefully all the way to the top. That when the CEO gives a speech somewhere, you say, this thing that I'm doing in one corner of my organization lines all the way up to that, and I can draw that path. I think it's very important.
You mentioned quite a few things I would love to jump on. I don't know that we'll have time for, but right at the end there, you mentioned, utilizing KPIs. One of the things we used at Gartner was we use the term key risk indicator versus key performance indicator. And what these things indicate, this is the risk that we're taking if we don't adopt. We would typically use this when we were engaging with chief information security officers, anybody in security, for instance, right? That's a powerful message, but I found that you can actually correlate that outside of security issues. And it's like, if we don't do this, we're going to lose a competitive edge because of X, right? Or if we don't keep this technology that we've been using, we're going to lose this functionality. It's going to affect, say, our search engine, which will cause more call-ins to the help desk, which causes, costs, X per call. We're gaining a loss versus just, the spend that we're putting towards this product. Have you ever, sort of used that tactic, whether you use the term KRI or something else?
Yeah, I've not personally used that term, key risk indicators, but yeah, always looking for the potential risks, um, both of adopting and not adopting the technology, right? Again, you roll out a Gen AI tool without any kind of guardrails, without any processes, without any kind of notification this is happening. You just spit it out because everybody else is doing it. That's a risk and probably not a good one. And then you roll back the technology. And once you roll something back and you try to do it over, that doesn't go very well, right? People are risk adverse in that sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's that kind of risk of actually adopting the technology and not being ready for it. Then there's the risk of not doing it. And as you said, and quite rightly, you may not know exactly what's happening inside your competitors' organizations, but you can look at the world and take a good guess, right? If my company is thinking we should have a taxonomy and ontology management system, for example, you can probably bet that your competitors are either thinking about the same thing or already have one. And what risk is there in not doing that? What's the advantage or disadvantage of not sort of falling in line with them? Um, or perhaps investing in things that might potentially leapfrog you ahead of them, right? If you know that your industry is slow to adopt technology and you're doing everything in one way and you see an opportunity to do that in a new way, which may improve your processes or your ROI or whatever it is, maybe it's worth investing in that new technology and trying it. And again, assessing to make sure your company's ready for it. Um, but risk can be found everywhere, right? You mentioned a search engine. If people are bouncing off your website and you're not generating revenue there, that's a risk, if you're in retail.
Yep.
Then there's other kinds of risks. Now, at a company like Nike, for example, we work with public personas, athletes, right? And they are contracted, and we make products based on that contracting, and we operate in multiple countries. And so there's a lot of potential risk if you make a product out of a certain material and you send it to a country that has rules and regulations around that material, that's a real risk, right?
Definitely.
If you're not securing your data, you talked about security, and you're operating in the US and you're operating in Asia or Europe, completely different rules around the data regulations, right? You have legal risk, as I was mentioning, with things like athletes. So you have a contract with an athlete. Let's say that contract ends and your product is still showing up on the website. That could be a real problem, right? So
It's a
there's risk
perfect
kind of
use case for Semaphore, by the way, Aaron, just FYI. Sorry,
uh,
continue.
it, it using taxonomy and ontology to help solve those problems is absolutely something obviously that I believe in because I'm a taxonomist, but it really is a good use case for those kinds of like risk detection and understanding and aligning what kinds of things if you follow the whole chain and you say, well, we use metadata from a taxonomy to tag products, which the products then go to a website and you are tagging them incorrectly with the wrong athlete or whether it's available. And some of that technology or some of that functionality is going to be in your taxonomy system and some is going to be on a web content management system or something on a web server. But you have to make sure those things align so that the wrong things don't show up. Um, and that can be a huge risk. Mistagging products as being something they're not could just be, oops, well, that looks silly. I asked for green and you showed me red. Okay,
Mhm.
not high risk, pretty low risk. I mean, you may not trust the results after that, so there's some risk,
Well,
right? But it's a lot worse to show a product. Some cultures you cannot show models who have tattoos. So if you throw up an image of somebody with
mhm.
tattoos wearing your product, that could be worse risk. So
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things you brought up now a couple of times, so I feel compelled to sort of comment on that is Gen AI, right? And there's a lot of risk in that. And you actually just mentioned, you might, not have trust in the output of that system any longer. That's a big deal because if business leaders can't make a decision and trust the output of what those Gen AI applications are doing, it becomes a lost cause, right? It's a lot of investment, a lot of time, and there's data out there that shows, organizations that build their own Gen AI tools quit sort of halfway through. Like over 50% of those projects fail, right? Costing billions of dollars. It's pretty eye popping. So I'm just going to plug the Progress data platform solution that we have. If you're interested, just go to the Progress website and you can look it all up there. But we're really doing some great stuff with utilizing Semaphore within that solution to create trust in the output of your Gen AI, which is pretty cool. So another thing because obviously you have experience with Progress using Semaphore, which is built off of taxonomy management, also metadata management as well. A lot of customers come to me and just reiterate to invite the audience. I do these custom getting business buy-in programs, case by case, for our customers, right? Customers, prospects, and it's agnostic to Semaphore. I can do it for any tool, but what I get a lot of is a lot of slides showing how to build a taxonomy. And I get a lot of pushback when I say, you don't want to show them, how to make the sausage, how you make the sausage. You want to show them the output. What's the benefit of doing, these exercises? Have you found showing the business how a taxonomy is made shows any value to them? Are they interested in it? Are they,
I have learned my lesson the hard way from being in this industry for a long time, because that was my lead for the longest time, right? Taxonomies, let me show you what they're all about.
Right.
And then the eyes glaze over, and every now and then you get somebody who's like, I love taxonomy, I'm sold, and they become a big ally in maybe even building taxonomies or reviewing taxonomies. But generally you get this, I don't care, right? I don't care about taxonomies. I want the thing to work, right? I don't care about your fancy ontologies. I want this thing to work properly. And it took me probably too long to realize, flip the script and show them a search engine bringing up things fantastically. And they go, wow, how did you do that? It's working amazingly. You say metadata. And you know where that metadata came from? It came from a taxonomy. And you may or may not be interested in that. If you are, I can tell you more. If you're not, that's fine, right? But you show them the end product, you show them the results of a positive use case, and then you, depending on the audience, right? Some audience may be like, I don't need to know anymore. It's great. I don't want you to show me anymore. And other parts of the audience may say, I want to dig into that. Maybe they're more technical and they really want to understand graph databases. It's possible.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'll have that sort of retort back when I say, you want to remove this off. And I'm like, you can have those conversations if they're specifically requested,
right,
off channel, right?
Yes.
Right. Sorry, did you have anything you wanted to?
No, I agree though that if you dive into the complexity or the potential complexity, or try to educate them on the field of taxonomy, which as taxonomists we kind of like to do, we like them to understand what we do and our value, but there's other ways to approach it rather than starting that way. Show them the end result of the thing that you're trying to get to, even if it's a mock-up, even if you haven't built it yet. It could be like this. And I took a screenshot and I made things up and it's completely fanciful, but it could be this way.
It's great art of the possible type of conversation. But if you lead with the end result, you might actually get more people that are like, actually, I would like to learn more about taxonomy, but they're in the right headspace then, right?
Right.
And you can sort of ask them what they want to know, simplify it in a manner that's easy for them to digest. But you want to keep it high level I've seen, literally over 100 slides on how a taxonomy is built that they were going in to, sort of sell the wares of Semaphore, right? It's just like, no, that's not going to work, and it never does, at least in my experience. Um, since we also, we brought up Gen AI, that's an obvious in your face future trend to technology adoption. And not focusing here necessarily on adopting Gen AI tools necessarily, but in getting sort of, buy-in for technology. Do you see any trends, anything on the horizon that, either one could help you sort of get that buy-in, or that would be an obstacle there?
Yeah, I think, well, as I've already mentioned, and this is just continuing, it doesn't matter what kind of technology um, is to be transparent, be clear, um, and be very focused on the use case that this thing is trying to address. And I think so getting into trending technologies, you obviously need to address security, risk, exposure, and whatnot. And then you also have to be very focused about what the use case is, because I've definitely have seen, oh, Gen AI, using that example again, is super hot. We need to use it. What for? We don't know. We just need to use it. If you don't know what you want to use it for, that's not a great use case, right? Be really succinct and say, what is Gen AI good at, for example, or what is this technology good at? And if you want to pursue technology and going back to the use case, then what good use cases do you have that fit it? Now, generally, I'd say don't start there. Start with your use case, start with your problem, the challenge, and look for the technology that fits it. But you'll see, obviously with trending things, you want to be quick to adopt, and so you see it push the other way. But be really clear. Don't. I would avoid trying to find just whatever use cases, or perhaps letting a vendor lead necessarily. They may know your space, right? They may know your space and be able to say, if you're a company of this type, you probably have this problem. Is this true? Then we can explore that, right? But really, you need to know your own company and know what's happening and understand what your needs are before you start just jumping on the bandwagon with trending technologies. You have to know what's in place. And again, I think it comes to that maturity. If you don't have processes in place for enterprise data governance, for example, or things or legal or security or any of your data practices in alignment, and then you try to do something like generative AI, you're going to find that you run up against problems right away, right? It's like, oh, you're using all of our data that probably we've mismanaged, and you're throwing it into this tool and it's spitting things out, and now we don't trust it because we didn't trust the data, and that's a mess, right? So definitely having some kind of sense of order, and maybe biting off something really small and saying, we're going to do POCs, right? Proof of concept projects, to look at this new technology because we do think it's interesting, but we're going to find a very narrow use case so that we can create sort of a sandbox within the organization of, we're going to feed it some clean data, we're going to wall it off, we're going to do this thing, and then see how that went. And then can we consider scaling to another use case or to the enterprise?
So that's a great point. I would, I'd add to that too. Like when, you're looking at things like Gen AI, yes, you want to focus on that business case that you can be successful with, but that can easily expand to other things. And the first thing when you started talking about this that popped in my head was privacy, right? So, we can focus, at a company, look, we know we have data going back, 50, 60, 70 years. And we've got people's bank account numbers, social security numbers, things like that. We want to make sure we extract all that information and get rid of it before we deposit it, say, in a database system, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that we know all of these privacy laws are being either adopted, updated, changed altogether, and that's going to keep happening, especially as different countries get different leadership in, and will have their own sort of modus operandi. You got to be prepared for that. So it's, let's do this, let's be real successful, let's prove that out, and here's the things that we think we can do in the future as well.
And that's a really great point about, I mean, obviously a company like Nike or any company in that retail space, of course, we have a ton of customer data, and probably not the best place to start with doing things where you're generating new text or new ideas. Probably don't want to start with your customer data. Not that you
Mm,
couldn't do an experiment using a new
right.
technology with customer data, but you better make sure that's very walled off, that you're not exposing it publicly, that you're not exposing even internally, that you're not, I
It's
should
not in
not, in
production. Yeah.
right, in my role, I should never see a customer's social security number. Right. I should never see that. That's not my job. I don't deal with that data. It should never be exposed to me. Right. So, understanding who the audience is, what kinds of data they typically work with. Maybe if you're in marketing, you can see some of that data, but again, it's sort of walled off. You do your experiment, you do your POC, you see if it can scale, and then see what happens. But being very careful never to expose that data to anybody internally or externally that you shouldn't expose it to.
Great points. I think we're close to running out of time. I think I got time for at least one more question
Great.
before we go to the
Sure.
audience. But as a technology leader, what advice can you give to other technology leaders who are struggling to get the business or the
Yeah.
board to buy in with
Yeah.
your initiatives?
I think the key one, the critical one is understand what's important to the business. And whether it's a positive forward-thinking strategy that's important to the business, or whether it's solving lots of pain is important to the business, right?
Mm,
Maybe your culture is very depressed, because like, oh, everything we're using is out of date and well, we're just not competing anymore, and it's depressing and your environment is not pleasant. That's important to note, and it's important to deal with that. And how does technology fit in with that culture, as much as a very gung-ho, we're moving forward and we're doing cool and innovative things? When no matter what state of mind your culture is, understand what's important to them. Understand the market that you're in, the industry you're in, the goals, the objectives, the greater strategy, if the strategy shifts, right? Be specific about your industry so you can address specific trends and use cases that are in it, and the reality of the business pain points, not just what the pain points are assumed to be, right? If you're coming from one section of the org to another, you may not really understand what they're going through. And so understanding their problems, whether it's through interviews or surveys, I think one-on-one interviews are a great way to do things, um, to understand exactly what is important to them, right? Because what's important to the business at that huge CEO strategic level and what's important to you doing your job may or may not be the same. Now, hopefully you're in a position where you see yourself as part of this org, and it's gonna ladder up. The perhaps small things you do influence all the way to the top, right? And you see yourself as part of this greater thing that's happening. Or maybe you just do your job and you just want your job to be good, and
mm,
maybe you're less concerned with the overall strategy of the organization. You just want to do the thing you're doing. And so it's really important to understand that. I think another thing that's important to know is the business doesn't always know what to ask for. So there's this sort of balancing act of, one, if you're in technology side, understanding the business really well and being partnered with the business very closely so you understand what they need to try and pitch things to them that may help them, right? Because they don't know how to ask for it. Like, I didn't know this was technically possible, right? So I'm going to pitch an idea to you and to show you again the art of the possible, right? Um, but if they do know what they want, then of course listening to them, and knowing what they're asking for and trying to translate that into, again, added functionality on tools you have, or perhaps purchasing completely new technologies.
excellent. Ahren, I really appreciate you coming on. We're out of
Yeah,
time,
thank you.
but we want to open it up to the audience. So Hanal, I'm going to ask you to pop back in
Thanks very much.
and carry on from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard and Aaron, for leading that thoughtful and insightful discussion. Before we get started on the Q&A portion, I would like to share some information here on the screen about Semaphore. So if you scan this QR code right here, you can access new release information as well as product information, just by scanning the QR code there.
And then moving on to getting or having some reviews. If you have been using Semaphore and have a few minutes, we'd be greatly appreciative for sharing your experience. And we're gathering reviews on 2 platforms and would truly value your perspective. Now we'll move on to the Q&A portion of today's session. Gerard and Ahren, if you could rejoin us, we'll begin with a few questions we've received. Starting off with, first, what strategies have you found most effective when translating technical requirements into business language that resonates with leadership?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've already talked a little bit about this, but tying technical requirements to the KPIs, the objectives, the goals that matter most to the leadership, and reusing the language of leadership so that it really hits those familiar buttons, I think is really a good way of 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 tying those two things together and sort of translating them, right? So if you think of statements about technology where you're saying, I want a function that does X so that I can do Y. And that second part of the statement uses the same kind of language that um, your leadership is using, whether that's all the way at the top from a CEO or if that's your direct leadership. Tying those two things together so that whenever they hear your messaging about the technical or technological functionality and how that um, relates to directly to their objectives, I think it really resonates with leadership to hear basically you're pitching their own language back to them. So of course they're going to like that because that's what they want to hear, but you're tying it directly back to that technology and you're saying, I want to do X so that you can do Y. And obviously, depending on the level and which leadership you're talking to, don't get overly technical, right? They frequently don't want to hear those things. They don't need a deep dive on how the thing works. For most leadership, they're not concerned unless they're in a technology leadership position. Then they may be concerned and they want to hear that. But otherwise, keep it at that higher level and tie it directly to their language. I think is a good way to do things.
That's a great point, Ahren. Sorry, go ahead, Gerard.
Yeah, I would just add, one of my colleagues, Lance Feashan, this is an old boss of his, Seth Ryerson, no relation to Ned, um, used to say, if it's not saving money, if it's not making money, or if it's not reducing risk, why would the business invest in it? Now, we can certainly broaden on that. There's reasons why they would invest, for other reasons around that, depending on their, specific drivers, around business. But also, keep in mind, especially with a product, say like Semaphore, right? It's kind of niche. It's middleware. A lot of our customers will say, well, how do I, propose the ROI? I actually go through that in a little bit of detail in the part 1 of the series here. But if you're supporting, using Semaphore to support search engine, for example, and my customers will say, well, Gerard, we don't own the search engine, we just support it. And I'm like, then you own the ROI for whatever the search engine is returning to the business. You own that. So just because you're just a part of that, if you have a car and one of the wheels are missing, that car doesn't go, right? So the same thing with the technology. It might not be the CRM system, right? But it might be something that supports your CRM system. You own the ROI just as much as any other technology that supports that system. So if you kind of look at it more big picture, Ahren, maybe you disagree on that, but is that making sense?
Oh,
Is
yeah.
not to be afraid to own ROI of a larger system that your technology is going to be in support of or already is in support of.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that point. Moving on to the second question. Next, how do you recommend showing the long-term value of new technology initiatives, especially when the immediate impact isn't always visible?
Yeah. I think having a milestone driven strategic roadmap can really sort of show that value because it does a couple things. If you have that roadmap and you really flesh it out, it shows that you've invested the time to understand both the product and what it does and what it brings to the organization, but also you understand the organizational needs, right? That you're not just focused on one part. So having that roadmap, and that roadmap I think should include sort of delivery-based milestones. It can be onboarding team-based. In other words, like what different teams, how are we rolling this out and which teams are onboarding at different times. Um, it can be based on the project work and when you expect to complete it, or a combination of all these things. And you stretch that out over X number of years of return, because usually that's how long it's going to take, right? It's not going to be done in a few months. It's going to be done in years. And you sort of stretch that out and say, okay, here's a 5-year roadmap. And maybe the end of the roadmap is not as well defined because it's future thinking, but that first year is very clear. This is what we're going to deliver, what kinds of functionality, to whom, supporting which use cases and projects. And if you can even bake in some projected money savings or expected goals on return on investment, that's even better. So I think it's really important to have that strategic roadmap, um, that shows really that you've thought this through very thoroughly, um, and that you expect impact even if you don't see it tomorrow.
Great answer. Nothing to add there. I know.
Great point, Aaron. Moving on to the third question we've got here. When multiple departments are involved, how do you approach cross-functional alignment during vendor evaluations or technology selection?
Yeah, that can be really challenging, because what I've seen frequently is that it's not very common that a technology, at least in my experience, is rolled down from the top, right? It can happen when you've got big, I don't know, ERP systems or something like that, and you do this multi-million dollar software installation, and it's huge enterprise impact, and that can definitely happen. But what I see often, what happens is some group in the organization identifies a need, and then either has a software or technology in mind or wants to start that investigation. And they may or may not understand the needs of other business teams. Um, and frequently that functionality does cut across different business teams and they would have buy-in. So I think it's really important to identify the use cases. Again, always put the use cases and the requirements first, know what those are, and then find the commonalities between teams. And if the technology is very niche and team specific, well, then you don't really have to even worry about that, right? It's a financial tool. Finance is going to use it. Done. Nobody else needs to really be involved except for possible integrations. But usually I mean, especially let's go back to taxonomy and ontology software. This should be software that is enterprise wide. In my mind, it should impact the whole org. It should not be marketing only, or pick another department that they're the only department using it. It shouldn't be that way. It should be a centralized enterprise. So you have to, whatever group starts that conversation about it, again, whether it's enterprise level or whether it's one team, you need to engage with those other teams and show them where they intersect in terms of use case and needs. Like, what does that functionality bring to everybody? And then as individual teams perhaps roll onto it or become more involved in the project, then you get narrower on their specific needs that they might have functionality requirements for that the other teams don't. And just like we talked about including the business early in the process, include all of the business early. Well, you don't want to start a project with one team or organization in your overall enterprise that is driving this forward and then say, well, we're 6 months into it and now we're inviting another team in. They're going to feel left out. They're going to feel like their considerations weren't weighed. So even if they don't have input till later, involve them from the start and say, we're rolling this out in stages. We want you to be aware. We want you to be bought in. We want you to be involved, but we're not going to actually engage you for 6 months. But you need to know now. I think that's a fair way to do it, to just let them know it's coming so that they expect this thing to happen. And I've seen that work out actually pretty successfully where a tool has come in and they've said, okay, we're only engaging X number of teams to start because we're not ready for these other teams yet, but at least we let them know that it's coming.
I think it's a great point. And it's, I like what you said about involving all the business, right? Don't be picky. don't be afraid, right? It's, you're focusing on what you can do today, but you see those opportunities for tomorrow that will directly affect those teams. So even if you're just planting that seed today, they'll be more able to, more prepared for that and consider that, for their future purposes. A great thing involving other business units too is often say, marketing typically has a huge budget, right, available. They might have a much larger budget than your sort of, smaller group. That's a great way to offset the cost and say, hey, we see this benefit for you. Would you mind, would you consider investing in this? Because it'll bring us quicker value, to your business unit.
Great perspectives on both Ahren and Gerard. And then to lead here, wrapping up with our last question. In your view, what role do customer success stories or peer examples play in making a strong business case for technology adoption?
Yeah, I think that really kind of depends on your organizational culture. I think there's definitely industries and organizations that are always looking to their competitors to sort of understand what the state of the market is. And then there's other organizations and their culture, and for whatever reason, they think, I don't really need to look at my competitors. Maybe I'm the I think I'm the best one in the industry, or I think I don't really like what my competitors are doing. That's not as common. I'd say that um, a lot of organizations, as long as the use cases of the success stories are in the same industry and not sort of translating across industries, like if I work at Nike, I don't really want to see a success story necessarily from the medical industry. It may be interesting, but it's not going to resonate with me. Um, but if I see one from a competitor where they have done something with similar technologies and they've reached an end result, and I can understand sort of that use case and how it would apply to me, I think to me that resonates to say, well, if they had success with it and I'm a similar industry and a similar model, then why wouldn't I? Right, if it's translatable. So I think use cases can really help.
And I would agree. Industry specific is seems to be the modus operandi of most organizations. They want to hear in industry stories. But what I would say is I would have a lot of instances in my past where I'd be working with federal entities, right? And they would come to me and say, Gerard, we actually want to speak to the healthcare industry or the retail industry, right? About certain technologies and how they manage this, issue. So, don't be afraid of that. But yes, I would say 99 out of 10 times, Ahren, you're absolutely right. And like you said, it's going to be a cultural, sort of decision that you go with, whether that's going to be acceptable. If you've seen it done in the past in your organization, you can give it a try. If you've not, it might not be the time to experiment with that.
Thanks, Ahren and Gerard. That brings us to the end of our Q&A section and our Getting Business Buy-in Part 2 webinar. A huge thank you to both Ahren and Gerard for joining us and sharing valuable insights and leading a thoughtful and engaging discussion with the audience. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to the Progress team. We look forward to seeing you at our next Semaphore event. Thank you again for attending.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.